What if everything we know about human history is only the latest version of the story, not the first, not even the second, but just one chapter in a series of worlds that have risen and fallen over and over again? Entire civilizations, more advanced than we can imagine, could have existed long before us, only to be wiped away, leaving almost nothing behind. If history has been reset more than once, how much of our past is actually real, and how much has been erased forever? The strange idea of a reset past. Most of us grow up thinking of history as one long, unbroken line. We imagine it like a timeline in a school textbook, starting with simple hunter-gatherers, slowly moving into farming, then cities, kingdoms, industry, and finally, the modern world. It's a neat, clean story that makes sense. A steady climb from ignorance to knowledge, from stone tools to smartphones. But what if that story is incomplete? What if it's not a single straight line at all, but a series of lines, each one ending abruptly, then starting over again from scratch? The idea that history might have been reset more than once sounds strange, even impossible. But when you really think about it, the past we know is based on what has survived. We piece together history from what's left behind. Bits of stone, broken pottery, old buildings, and writings that haven't been destroyed by time. And here's the problem: almost everything made by humans eventually disappears. Even steel rusts, concrete crumbles, and books turn to dust. If something is left alone for just a few thousand years, nature will reclaim it completely. Now imagine if an entire civilization, as advanced as ours, or even more advanced, existed long before our current one and then vanished. It might not take much for almost every trace of it to disappear. A massive flood, a volcanic eruption, a shifting climate, or even a global war could erase cities, records, and technology in a shockingly short time. 1,000 years later, the only things left might be a few strange artifacts buried deep underground, and without the full picture, we might not even recognize them for what they are. This idea isn't just science fiction. Even in our own recorded history, we see how fragile civilizations can be. The ancient city of Pompeii was erased in a single day by a volcanic eruption. The Library of Alexandria, which may have contained the entire written knowledge of the ancient world, was destroyed by fire, wiping out countless books and ideas forever. And those were small-scale events compared to what could happen globally. If resets have happened before, that means the human story might be far older and far more complex than we've been taught. We could be living on top of layer after layer of forgotten worlds, each one with its own cities, languages, technologies, and cultures, all lost to time. Some of those worlds might have reached heights we haven't yet matched. Others might have been completely different from anything we can imagine, built on ideas and materials that left no obvious traces for us to find. Think about how quickly knowledge can vanish when it isn't preserved. If all the world's digital storage, computers, servers, the internet, were destroyed today, most of our information would be gone instantly. Paper records would last a little longer, but within a few centuries, they too would decay. Without people actively maintaining it, our entire history could fade away in a single lifetime. Future generations might know almost nothing about us, except for whatever small clues survived. That's what makes the reset idea so unsettling. It suggests that we might not be the first advanced society. We might just be the latest in a long chain of rises and falls. Each time, humanity, or whoever lived here before us, would rebuild, creating a new history, unaware that it wasn't truly starting from the beginning. When you start looking at history with this in mind, certain things become harder to explain. There are sudden jumps in human progress that seem too fast for the time period. There are ancient myths and legends that describe catastrophic floods, great fires, or strange visitors who taught humans the skills of civilization. And there are scattered archaeological finds, objects that seem out of place for their age, which are often dismissed as coincidences or mistakes in dating. But if resets are real, maybe these are glimpses of the worlds that came before us. This isn't about believing every wild theory or accepting every fringe claim. It's about recognizing how little we truly know. The further back we go in time, the thinner the evidence becomes. We're like someone trying to read a book when most of the pages are missing. We fill in the gaps with what makes sense to us, but that doesn't mean the story we imagine is the real one. If history has been reset before, it changes the way we think about ourselves. We're not the inevitable endpoint of progress. We're not the smartest or most advanced beings to ever live here, just the current chapter in an ongoing cycle. That means everything we've built, from our tallest skyscrapers to our most advanced science, could be temporary. It could all be swept away, and one day, people or something else might rebuild without even knowing we existed. This possibility is both humbling and unsettling. It forces us to question the neat, simple version of history we've been told, and it opens the door to a much stranger, deeper view of the past, one where civilizations can vanish almost without a trace, and where the story of the world is written and erased over and over again. The strange idea of a reset past isn't just a mystery about what came before, it's also a warning about what could happen in the future, because if it has happened before, there's no reason to think it couldn't happen again. Why the official timeline feels too neat. When you look at the way history is taught in schools, it has a certain polished structure. We start at the beginning, with early humans living in caves, learning to make tools and hunting for food. Then, like clockwork, farming arrives, villages grow into cities, cities form empires, and technology steadily improves until we arrive in the modern world. It feels logical, almost like an inevitable march forward. But the more you think about it, the more it seems suspiciously tidy, as if it's been cleaned up for presentation. Real life rarely works in a straight line. Progress in the real world is messy, unpredictable, and full of dead ends. Civilizations rise and fall, discoveries are made and forgotten, and entire ways of life can disappear overnight. Yet our official timeline presents history as though it's a smooth, linear climb, without major gaps or unexplained jumps. This should make us wonder, is this the full picture, or just the most convenient one? One reason the timeline looks so neat is that it's built on the evidence we currently have, and we have very little. For example, we're told that agriculture began about 10,000 years ago, but that's only based on the oldest evidence we've found so far. If farming had been discovered, lost, and rediscovered before that, we might never know. Archaeology is like finding random puzzle pieces scattered across a giant, mostly empty table. We put the pieces together the best we can, but we don't know how much of the picture is still missing. Another reason is that history has been rewritten many times, not necessarily out of conspiracy, but out of necessity. Records are destroyed, rewritten by victors, or shaped by the values of the time. The further back you go, the more uncertain things become. Historians have to fill the gaps with educated guesses. These guesses get written into textbooks, and over time they harden into facts, even if new discoveries should make us rethink them. There's also the issue of how we measure progress. We assume that human knowledge moves in one direction, forward, but history shows otherwise. After the fall of the Roman Empire, much of Europe lost access to technologies and knowledge that had been common for centuries. Plumbing, concrete, advanced architecture, even medical practices, all forgotten or ignored for hundreds of years. If something like this can happen in recorded history, it's not hard to imagine much larger collapses happening in the deeper past, wiping out knowledge entirely. When archaeologists find a 5000-year-old city, we call it the earliest known. But that's not the same as the first that ever existed. It just means it's the oldest one we've discovered so far. And considering how much of the Earth hasn't been excavated, and how much could be buried under oceans, deserts, or jungles, it's entirely possible that far older civilizations once existed and are now completely gone. Even the dates we do have are often open to debate. Carbon dating and other scientific methods are powerful tools, but they have limitations. In some cases, contamination or assumptions about how artifacts were buried can lead to results that don't tell the whole truth. If a civilization's remains were destroyed in a cataclysm and scattered, the pieces we find might not accurately represent when it really existed. This too neat version of history also struggles to explain certain anomalies, things that don't fit the official story, out-of-place artifacts, unexplained structures, and ancient myths that describe advanced technology are often brushed aside as errors or coincidences. But if history has been reset more than once, these anomalies might not be mistakes at all. They could be leftover fragments from earlier worlds. Another clue that the official timeline might be oversimplified is how suddenly certain civilizations appear in the record. Take ancient Egypt, for example. According to mainstream history, Egyptian civilization emerged around 5,000 years ago, but it did so almost fully formed, with complex architecture, writing, art, and social organization already in place. How did they go from primitive settlements to pyramid building so quickly? Maybe they didn't start from scratch at all. Maybe they inherited knowledge from a world that came before. The neatness of history also comes from our own need for a clear story. Humans like beginnings, middles, and ends. We want history to make sense, to have a logical flow. If we admitted that the past might be full of resets, erasures, and unknown chapters, the story would feel chaotic and uncertain. And uncertainty makes people uncomfortable. It's easier to accept a timeline that looks orderly, even if it's incomplete. This is not to say that historians are wrong or dishonest. They're working with the best information they have. But the truth is, we might be building our understanding of the past on top of an enormous gap. A gap where entire worlds could have existed, been erased, and left almost no trace. If history has been reset before, the official timeline we're taught might be more of a current edition than the full story. It's like reading the latest version of a book without knowing it's part of a long series, and all the earlier volumes have been lost. The more you look at history with this possibility in mind, the more you notice the odd patterns. Civilizations that spring up suddenly, ancient knowledge that disappears and reappears, gaps that seem too big to be just coincidence. And each time we discover something older than we thought possible, it should make us wonder how many times has this happened before. The official timeline feels neat because it's built for clarity, not complexity, but the real past, if resets have happened, would be far messier, far stranger, and far older than we've dared to imagine. The mystery of lost civilizations. Throughout history, we've uncovered traces of societies that seem to appear, thrive, and then vanish, sometimes without a clear reason. These lost civilizations are like ghost chapters in the story of humanity. We can see pieces of their achievements, but the rest is missing, leaving us to wonder how they lived, what they knew, and why they disappeared. The deeper we dig, the more we find that these mysteries might not be isolated. They could be part of a repeating cycle where worlds rise, fall, and are forgotten. One of the most famous examples is the Indus Valley Civilization, which existed thousands of years ago in what is now Pakistan and northwest India. It was one of the world's earliest urban cultures, with well-planned cities, advanced drainage systems, and organized trade. Then, around 1900 BCE, it collapsed. We don't know exactly why. Climate change, shifting rivers, disease, or conflict have all been suggested, but the truth is uncertain. What's even more striking is that for centuries afterward, much of what they achieved vanished from human knowledge. The language they wrote in remains undeciphered to this day. Then there's the case of the Maya in Central America. At their peak, the Maya built massive cities with pyramids, advanced astronomy, and a sophisticated calendar system. Yet large parts of their civilization fell into decline centuries before Europeans arrived. Again, the reasons are debated: drought, warfare, resource depletion, but the effect was the same. A once thriving world became scattered, its great cities swallowed by the jungle. These are just the examples we know about. They happened relatively recently in human history, and they still left behind enough ruins for us to study. But what about civilizations that existed much earlier, far beyond the reach of our current archaeological record? If a society rose to great heights tens of thousands of years ago and then disappeared, how much evidence would survive for us to find now? The answer is probably very little. Even our own modern cities would not last long without maintenance. Roads would crack, buildings would crumble, and metal would rust away. In just a few hundred years, nature would reclaim almost everything. A few thousand years after a collapse, only the most durable structures, made of stone, might remain, and even those could be buried or eroded beyond recognition. This means that a truly ancient, advanced civilization could have existed and left almost no visible trace by the time we came along. Some researchers point to oddities in the archaeological record that might hint at such civilizations. The massive stone blocks of Pumapunku in Bolivia, cut with precision that seems difficult to achieve even today, don't fit neatly into the capabilities we usually assign to the people of that era. The megaliths at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey are another example, a monumental site built over 11,000 years ago, long before mainstream history says complex societies should have existed. Sites like these raise questions. Were they the work of unusually advanced cultures for their time, or are they fragments of knowledge passed down from even earlier, now lost worlds? Ancient maps also offer strange clues. The Piri Reis map, created in the 1500s, appears to show parts of Antarctica's coastline without ice, something that, if accurate, would suggest the map was based on knowledge from a time when Antarctica wasn't frozen. Mainstream scholars debate these interpretations, but such anomalies fuel the idea that pieces of earlier civilizations might have survived into later eras, hidden in plain sight. Myths and legends from cultures around the world also tell stories of great cities or golden ages that ended in catastrophe. Atlantis is the most famous example, a highly advanced society said to have sunk into the sea. But similar tales appear elsewhere in Sumerian, Hindu, Native American, and Polynesian traditions. These stories might be pure imagination, or they might be distant memories of real civilizations destroyed long ago. Oral traditions have a way of preserving fragments of truth, even if the details get blurred over time. What's striking is how often these civilizations seem to vanish completely, leaving only scattered ruins or whispered legends. If we look at history through the lens of possible resets, these disappearances make more sense. A reset, whether caused by natural disaster, climate collapse, disease, or war, could erase most of a society's achievements almost overnight. Survivors might scatter, lose contact, and eventually forget the advanced knowledge their ancestors had. Over generations, the memory of what was lost might turn into myth. If this has happened more than once, it could explain why human progress appears to restart at different points in time. We may not be building for the first time, we may be rebuilding, each time starting from the pieces that survived the collapse. This perspective changes how we view lost civilizations. Instead of seeing them as random accidents in history, we might see them as chapters in a recurring pattern, each one ending in a reset. Some of these civilizations may have been as advanced as ours. Others may have been different in ways we can't imagine, using technologies or methods that left little trace for us to find. And just as their worlds ended, ours could too. The mystery of lost civilizations is not just about curiosity, it's about humility. We tend to think of ourselves as the peak of human achievement, but if resets have happened before, we are simply the latest in a long line of societies to stand on top of the world. And like all those before us, we are not immune to falling. Signs of forgotten ages. If history has been reset more than once, then somewhere in the world, there should be traces, faint, scattered signs that earlier chapters of human civilization once existed. These signs wouldn't look like a clear, obvious message carved into stone. Time erases almost everything. Instead, they'd be fragments, out-of-place clues, and puzzles that don't quite fit into our current understanding of the past. And when you start looking, you realize that such anomalies exist, enough to at least make you wonder if the story of humanity goes far deeper than we think. One of the most famous examples is Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. Mainstream archaeology dates it to about 11,000 years ago, long before the accepted birth of agriculture and permanent cities. Yet this site is a complex arrangement of massive stone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, decorated with intricate carvings of animals. According to the standard timeline, hunter-gatherers of that era shouldn't have been capable of such an organized, large-scale construction project. But here it stands, forcing historians to either push back the timeline of civilization or consider that this knowledge might have been inherited from somewhere even older. Then there are the megalithic structures scattered across the globe, like the giant stone platforms at Baalbek in Lebanon, the precise stonework of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, and the perfectly cut basalt columns at Nan Madol in Micronesia. These places are often explained as remarkable feats of ancient engineering, but in some cases, the level of precision, the size of the stones, or the sheer scale of the work seems difficult to match even today. If resets have happened, these could be remnants of techniques learned in a previous age and parsed down imperfectly after a collapse. Another intriguing sign comes from artifacts that seem too advanced for their time, the so-called out-of-place artifacts. One example is the Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek device discovered in a shipwreck, often called the world's first analog computer. It could track astronomical positions and eclipses with incredible accuracy. Historians believe it was built over 2,000 years ago, but no other device like it appears in the record for centuries afterward. If knowledge like this could exist, and then vanish for so long, it's easy to imagine even greater technologies disappearing entirely in a deeper past. We also find hints in the form of ancient maps that show places in ways they shouldn't. The Piri Reis map, created in the 1500s, appears to depict parts of the Americas and possibly Antarctica with surprising accuracy, far beyond the cartographic abilities of the time. Historians often explain this by suggesting the map was copied from older sources, which raises the question, just how old were those sources, and who made them? Even geological findings can hint at forgotten ages. There are locations where human-like footprints or tool marks seem to be embedded in rock layers far older than our accepted timeline for humanity. These cases are controversial and often dismissed, but they show how easily something that doesn't fit the mainstream view can be ignored or explained away. And then there are myths, not proof in themselves, but strange in their consistency. Across cultures, we hear stories of first peoples, golden ages, and catastrophic floods. From the Sumerian flood myth to the biblical story of Noah, to the flood legends of Native Americans and Pacific Islanders, there's a shared theme: a great disaster that wiped away a world, forcing survivors to start again. If resets have occurred, these myths might be distorted memories of real events, passed down through countless generations. Even the way we find sudden bursts of innovation in history could be a clue. Take the so-called Neolithic Revolution, when agriculture, animal domestication, and permanent settlements seemed to emerge almost simultaneously in different regions. How did such a leap happen so quickly? One possibility is that it was rediscovery, not invention, that people were rebuilding knowledge from an earlier erased age. The challenge is that none of these signs, on their own, prove that history has been reset. Each one can be explained in isolation. Göbekli Tepe as an exception to the rule, the Antikythera mechanism as a rare burst of genius, the flood myths as symbolic stories, but when you put them together, they form a pattern, a whisper that perhaps we are only seeing the surface of a much deeper history. Part of why these signs are so faint is that time is a ruthless editor. Organic materials decay, metals corrode, and even stone eventually erodes. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, floods, and shifting landscapes can bury entire cities. Some of the most promising areas for ancient ruins, like continental shelves that were dry land during the Ice Age, are now deep underwater. If advanced societies lived there and were destroyed when sea levels rose, their remains could be inaccessible to us without deep-sea exploration. It's also worth remembering that we're still in the early stages of uncovering the past. Just in the last century, archaeology has completely rewritten the history of multiple regions based on new discoveries. A few hundred years ago, entire civilizations like the Maya or the Indus Valley were unknown to the modern world. What will we discover in the next 100 years? And will some of those discoveries force us to confront the possibility that we're not the fullest? If we take the idea of reset seriously, then these scattered clues become more than just curiosities. They become evidence of a cycle. Civilizations rise, reach heights of knowledge and power, and then fall, leaving only fragments. Survivors rebuild, the fragments become myths, and eventually a new civilization grows until the process repeats. The signs of forgotten ages may be all around us, but they are quiet, subtle, and easy to overlook. They don't shout their message, they whisper it. Buried in stone, hidden in old stories, or locked away beneath the ocean floor. And perhaps the biggest sign of all is how quickly we forget, how easily the traces of even the greatest worlds can vanish, leaving only enough to make us wonder what might have been. The great erasers of time. If resets have happened before, then something must have been powerful enough to cause them. Not just a local disaster, not just the fall of one kingdom, but events so vast and destructive that they could erase the achievements of entire civilizations. These are the great erasers of time, forces that can wipe away cities, knowledge, and cultures, leaving little more than fragments for the distant future to find. The first and most obvious of these is nature itself. Earth is not a static place, it's a planet in constant motion, both on the surface and deep within. Massive volcanic eruptions can darken the sky, disrupt climates, and bury entire regions in ash. Think of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, which buried Pompeii so suddenly that people were frozen in place for nearly 2,000 years. Now imagine something hundreds of times larger, an eruption like the one at Toba in Indonesia, roughly 74,000 years ago, which some scientists believe caused a global volcanic winter. If a thriving civilization existed before such an event, its cities could have been covered, its farmland ruined, and its survivors scattered. Earthquakes are another relentless eraser. They can shatter buildings, change landscapes and even sink land into the sea. Whole towns have disappeared into cracks in the ground or been swallowed by landslides. Over centuries, shifting tectonic plates can bury ancient structures deep underground, hiding them from sight until they're stumbled upon by accident. Then there's water, perhaps the most thorough eraser of all. Floods can destroy on a local scale, but in the past, sea levels have risen dramatically. At the end of the last ice age, melting glaciers caused oceans to swallow entire coastal regions. Some researchers believe that vast areas now underwater, such as the submerged lands of Doggerland between Britain and mainland Europe, were once home to thriving human communities. If a civilization had been based along coastlines, as ours is today, a sudden rise in sea level could have erased almost every trace of it, leaving the remains on the ocean floor where they'd be nearly impossible to find. Fire, too, has a long history as a destroyer of civilizations. A single large fire can wipe out an entire city, especially in eras before modern firefighting, but on a larger scale, wildfires can burn forests, destroy crops, and force populations to flee. Combined with other disasters, they can turn a bad situation into a fatal one for an entire culture. Beyond nature, humanity itself has been one of the greatest erasers. War is not only destructive in the moment, burning cities, killing populations, but it also targets knowledge. Armies throughout history have destroyed libraries, temples, and archives, whether to erase the enemy's history or simply as an act of rage. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is the most famous example, but it's far from unique. Countless other repositories of knowledge have been lost to conquest and conflict, taking with them information that might have revealed much more about the past. Famine is another silent eraser. Without food, populations collapse, cities are abandoned, and infrastructure crumbles. When famine strikes repeatedly, it can drive mass migrations, break political systems, and wipe away the stability needed to preserve knowledge. Over time, even the memory of a famine's cause can disappear, leaving only ruins and speculation. Disease, too, has been a recurring force of historical erasure. The Black Death in the 14th century wiped out an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population, creating social and economic chaos. In the Americas, diseases brought by European contact devastated indigenous populations, erasing whole cultures before they could be recorded in detail. If such events happened in the deeper past, before written history, they could have ended entire civilizations without leaving much evidence. And then there are cosmic threats, rare but catastrophic. Asteroid impacts, like the one that ended the age of the dinosaurs, have the potential to erase life on a global scale. Smaller impacts, still powerful enough to devastate a region, could cause massive fires, tsunamis, and climate shifts. We've found craters on Earth that suggest such impacts happened within human history, though we don't fully understand their effects. All of these erasers share one thing in common: they don't just destroy physical structures, they destroy continuity. Civilization depends on passing knowledge from one generation to the next. When a disaster, natural or human-made, wipes out the keepers of that knowledge, the chain breaks. Survivors may know how to hunt, fish, or build shelter, but advanced skills, science, and technology can vanish in a single generation. Once gone, they're hard to recover. This is what makes the idea of historical reset so plausible. The forces that could cause them are not rare in Earth's history. They are normal, recurring features of life on this planet. The only difference between a small disaster and a reset is scale, and if the scale is large enough, if multiple disasters happen at once, or if the damage is global, a civilization could vanish almost without a trace. We sometimes think of our modern world as immune to such risks because of our technology, but in reality, we're more vulnerable in some ways. A massive solar storm could knock out satellites and power grids worldwide, crippling communication and infrastructure. A sudden changing climate could disrupt food supplies for billions, and if a truly global catastrophe struck, the systems we rely on might collapse so quickly that we'd have little time to adapt. The great erasers of time are always there, waiting. Most of the time they act on a small scale, affecting one region or one generation. But when they act on a global scale, they don't just change history, they restart it. Civilizations that once stood at the peak of their achievements can be reduced to rubble and myth, leaving the next rise to begin from whatever scraps are left behind. If this has happened more than once, it means that we might be standing on the ruins of worlds we will never fully know. And if it could happen before, it could happen again. But nature presses reset. When we think of history being reset, it's easy to imagine human actions, wars, invasions, or deliberate destruction. But long before humans had the power to shape the world on a large scale, nature itself was rewriting the planet's story. Earth has always been a restless, unpredictable place, and in the long view of time, civilizations, no matter how advanced, are fragile against its power. Nature has pressed the reset button before, and there's every reason to believe it will do so again. One of the most dramatic examples is volcanic activity. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815, though only 2 centuries ago, was enough to cause what became known as the year without a summer. Temperatures dropped worldwide, crops failed, and famine spread across multiple continents. That was just one eruption. Now imagine something like the Toba supervolcano, which erupted roughly 74,000 years ago. The ash cloud it produced may have covered much of the globe, blocking sunlight and causing temperatures to plunge for years. Some scientists believe this event nearly wiped out humanity, leaving only a small population to survive and rebuild. If there had been an advanced society before that eruption, it could have been erased almost completely. Earthquakes are another reminder of nature's strength. While we think of them as local disasters, the right quake in the right place could permanently destroy key centers of a civilization. Imagine a city that serves as the heart of trade, politics, and culture being reduced to rubble in minutes. Without modern construction methods, such an event could leave survivors without the resources to rebuild, forcing them to scatter over centuries. The memory of that city's greatness could fade into legend, while its ruins are buried beneath new layers of earth. But among nature's most powerful reset mechanisms, nothing has left a mark quite like ice. During the last ice age, glaciers covered vast parts of the planet, grinding mountains into valleys and reshaping entire continents. When the ice melted, sea levels rose dramatically, flooding coastal areas that had been dry land for thousands of years. If civilizations existed in those areas, as ours does today, almost all traces of them would now be underwater. We know of submerged structures off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean, but these are likely just the tip of the iceberg. The majority of the ocean floor remains unexplored, and it's possible that entire ancient cities lie hidden there. Climate change, whether natural or accelerated by human activity, is another force that can reset history. Shifts in rainfall patterns, temperature, and sea levels can make once thriving regions uninhabitable. The collapse of the Mayan civilization, for example, is thought to be linked to prolonged droughts. In a world without global trade to move food and resources, a shifting climate can mean starvation, migration, and the end of entire ways of life. In a deep past scenario, such changes could erase a civilization entirely, especially if they happened suddenly. And then there's the ocean itself. Tsunamis are among nature's fastest and most destructive events. In 2004, a massive undersea earthquake triggered a tsunami that devastated coastal regions around the Indian Ocean, killing hundreds of thousands of people. But in ancient times, such events could wipe out coastal settlements without leaving survivors to tell the story. If those settlements were the center of a civilization, the loss could be catastrophic enough to start a reset. Beyond Earth's own systems, the cosmos poses its own threats. Asteroid impacts are rare, but when they happen, they can change the planet in an instant. The asteroid that struck near modern-day Mexico 66 million years ago wiped out the dinosaurs and many other forms of life. Even a much smaller impact could have devastating effects on a human civilization: fires, dust clouds blocking the sun, and a collapse of agriculture. Craters like the one in the Arizona desert are reminders that such events are part of Earth's history. What makes natural resets so effective is not just their destructive power, but their ability to erase evidence. A volcanic eruption can bury cities under meters of ash. Rising seas can drown entire coastlines. Ice can grind human structures into dust. Over thousands of years, the Earth heals itself, covering over the scars with forests, grasslands, and oceans. To future generations, it can look as if nothing had ever been there. If resets have happened more than once, nature has likely been the main culprit. Human societies are resilient against small disasters, but when nature acts on a massive scale, especially when multiple disasters happen in close succession, survival becomes the only priority. Knowledge, technology, and culture all take a back seat. Without the ability to preserve them, these achievements vanish. It's also important to realize that nature doesn't need a single massive event to cause a reset. Sometimes, a slow but relentless process can be just as effective. Centuries of gradual climate change, repeated flooding, or steady land erosion can hollow out a civilization's stability until it collapses. To the people living through it, the change might feel manageable year to year, until one day the society can no longer sustain itself. Our modern world gives us a false sense of security. We have satellites, weather prediction, and global communication, but we're still vulnerable. A massive solar storm, for example, could cripple the electrical systems we rely on. A series of volcanic eruptions could disrupt food supplies worldwide, and sea levels are already rising, threatening major cities. In other words, the same forces that may have ended past civilizations are still with us, waiting. When nature presses reset, it doesn't leave a note. It doesn't explain what happened. It simply sweeps the board clean and lets life begin again in whatever form it can. If this has happened multiple times in the deep past, it would explain why our history has gaps, why we find strange anomalies, and why civilizations sometimes seem to appear out of nowhere. The survivors of each reset would be forced to start over, carrying only scraps of memory from the world that came before. And perhaps without even knowing it, we're already living on the ruins of those worlds. War and the destruction of knowledge. When we think of war, we often focus on the immediate destruction, the battles, the ruined cities, the loss of life. But war has another quieter effect that can be even more lasting: the erasure of knowledge. Buildings can be rebuilt, populations can recover, but once the accumulated wisdom of a civilization is destroyed, it is often gone for good. In this way, war can be a powerful reset button, forcing societies to relearn things they once knew. Throughout history, war has repeatedly wiped away centuries of progress in a matter of days. One of the most famous examples is the burning of the Library of Alexandria. This vast collection of scrolls and manuscripts may have contained detailed records of ancient science, medicine, philosophy, and history from across the known world. The exact circumstances of its destruction are debated, but the result is clear. A massive portion of human knowledge was lost forever. Without those writings, future generations had to rediscover ideas that may have been common knowledge centuries earlier. Another example is the fall of the Roman Empire. At its height, Rome had advanced engineering, architecture, legal systems, and public works like aqueducts and roads. But as the empire fragmented under repeated invasions and internal conflict, much of this infrastructure fell into disrepair. The knowledge of how to build certain structures, produce certain materials, and maintain large-scale systems was lost in many parts of Europe for centuries. The result was a period often referred to as the Dark Ages, where the level of technology and organization declined significantly compared to the Roman era. War destroys knowledge in multiple ways. First, it targets physical repositories, libraries, archives, universities, and temples, either intentionally or as collateral damage. Second, it kills or displaces the people who hold that knowledge. Skilled artisans, scientists, and teachers can be lost in a single generation. Third, it disrupts the systems that preserve and transmit knowledge. If a war disrupts education, trade, and communication for long enough, the ability to maintain complex skills disappears. Sometimes, the destruction of knowledge in war is deliberate. Conquerors may erase the history of the cultures they defeat to weaken their identity. The Spanish conquest of the Americas, for example, led to the destruction of countless Mayan and Aztec codices, illustrated books that recorded history, astronomy, and rituals. In many cases, this was done intentionally to replace indigenous belief systems with European ones. In doing so, entire worldviews and centuries of accumulated knowledge were erased. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century offer another stark example. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, they destroyed the House of Wisdom, one of the greatest centers of learning in the medieval world. This library contained works in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature from multiple civilizations. According to historical accounts, so many books were thrown into the Tigris River that the waters ran black with ink. The loss was not just cultural, it set back scientific progress in the region for generations. War also resets history in a more subtle way by controlling the narrative. The victors often rewrite the past to suit their needs, erasing or altering events that don't fit their version of the story. Over time, these altered records become accepted as truth, while the real history fades away. In this way, the reset is not just physical but mental, shaping how future generations understand their own origins. What makes war such an effective eraser is that it often strikes at the height of a civilization's development. The more advanced a society becomes, the more it depends on complex systems, trade networks, communication routes, and specialized knowledge, all of which can be dismantled quickly under the pressure of conflict. Once disrupted, these systems can be extremely difficult to rebuild, especially if the war also damages the society's food supply, economy, and population. Even in modern times, we've seen how quickly knowledge can be lost during war. Museums are looted, archives are burned, and digital records are destroyed. Wars in the 20th and 21st centuries have wiped out centuries-old libraries and archaeological sites, sometimes in a matter of hours. The difference now is that much of our information is digital, which makes it both easier to copy and easier to lose completely if the infrastructure collapses. If we apply this to the possibility of historical resets, it's easy to imagine a scenario where a highly advanced civilization could be reduced to a pre-industrial state in a single generation of war. Without functioning cities, manufacturing, or records, survivors might focus entirely on day-to-day survival. Skills like medicine, engineering, and navigation could vanish within decades. Within a few centuries, the descendants of those survivors might have no idea that their ancestors once built great cities or traveled the world. In this sense, war doesn't just erase the past, it creates a false present. It leaves people thinking that their current level of development is the highest their culture has ever achieved, when in reality, it might just be the latest step after a devastating reset. When we look at the ruins of ancient cities, it's tempting to think they were abandoned slowly, over time, but history shows us that they could have been emptied almost overnight, their knowledge scattered and lost in the chaos of conflict. If such events happened in the distant past, Before written history, there would be little left to tell us what had been destroyed. This is why war, as an eraser of history, fits so neatly into the idea that resets may have happened more than once. It is not only capable of destroying the physical remnants of a civilization, but also of severing the chain of knowledge that connects one generation to the next. And once that chain is broken, the reset is complete. The vanishing records problem. When we think about understanding the past, we tend to imagine that history is stored somewhere, in books, on stone tablets, in museums, just waiting to be read. But the truth is, the record of our history is fragile. It doesn't take much for it to disappear. In fact, most of human history has already vanished, not because someone deliberately destroyed it, but because time itself is relentless. This is the vanishing records problem, the simple reality that without constant effort to preserve them, the traces of a civilization fade until almost nothing remains. The first challenge is that most of what humans create is made from materials that don't last. Paper, cloth, wood, and even many types of metal break down when exposed to moisture, sunlight, or air. A single fire, flood, or insect infestation can destroy centuries of records in hours. Even in our modern world, where we store information digitally, the problem remains. Hard drives fail, formats become obsolete, and without power to keep them running, servers and data centers are useless. If a reset were to happen today, the vast majority of our digital history could be unreadable within a few decades. Archaeologists estimate that written history, meaning actual recorded accounts, only goes back about 5,000 years. But humans have existed in their modern form for roughly 300,000 years. That leaves an enormous gap, filled only by scattered artifacts and a lot of guesswork. We assume that the period before writing was pre-civilization, but that's largely because we have no records from it. If there were complex societies before writing, or before the records we have now, they may have left almost nothing for us to find. Stone carvings and monuments last longer than paper or wood, but even they aren't permanent. Wind, water, earthquakes, and erosion wear them down. In just a few thousand years, inscriptions can become unreadable, entire buildings can collapse and be buried. In dense jungle or shifting desert, ruins can vanish from sight completely. Without active maintenance, nature reclaims everything. Sometimes, the problem isn't just decay, it's deliberate clearing of old records to make space for new ones. Many ancient societies reused materials because resources were limited. In ancient Egypt, for example, stone from older temples was sometimes taken and used in new construction. In medieval Europe, scribes often scraped the ink off old parchment to reuse it for new writing. To them, the past was less important than the present, and valuable material couldn't go to waste. As a result, countless older records were erased forever. War and conquest compound the problem. A single siege or invasion can destroy archives, libraries, and temples that hold a culture's history. But even without war, records can be lost simply because the people who made them didn't see the need to preserve them. Many societies relied on oral tradition, stories, songs, and teachings passed from person to person. This works well for a while, but over generations, details change, facts are lost, and eventually the original knowledge fades into legend. There's also the issue of selective preservation. Not every record is kept. Rulers, governments, and religious authorities often decide what is worth saving and what should be forgotten. In some cases, inconvenient or dangerous information is deliberately erased. This official history problem means that even when records survive, they may not tell the whole truth. Then there's the role of chance. We know about Pompeii not because it was the only city of its time, but because it happened to be buried in volcanic ash, which preserved it. The Dead Sea Scrolls survived for 2,000 years, only because they were sealed in jars and hidden in dry caves. If those events hadn't happened, we might know nothing about them. This means our picture of history is shaped by accidents, by the rare cases where conditions were just right for preservation. When we think about possible resets in history, the vanishing records problem becomes critical. If a civilization were to collapse, whether due to natural disaster, war, or something else, the survival of its records would depend almost entirely on luck. Without a constant chain of people copying, preserving, and protecting those records, they would disappear. In 1,000 years, there might be no trace of the civilization's achievements, no matter how advanced it had been. It's sobering to realize how close we are to losing even our modern records. If electricity stopped flowing tomorrow, our digital archives would begin to degrade almost immediately. Within a few decades, much of the internet would be unreadable without the proper hardware and software. Paper records would fare better, but even they would eventually decay without controlled storage. In the grand scale of history, the lifespan of most of our information is shockingly short. This fragility is why the official history we have today might represent only a fraction of the real story. The civilizations we know about are the ones whose records survived by chance or deliberate preservation, but there could have been others, many others, whose stories have been completely erased. If resets have happened more than once, each one would wipe away the majority of a civilization's records, leaving the survivors to start fresh with only fragments of memory. Even the ruins we do find can be misleading. A handful of artifacts doesn't tell the full story of a culture's achievements. Without written explanations, we have to guess at their meaning. This leads to gaps, misinterpretations, and sometimes outright dismissal of discoveries that don't fit the established timeline. The vanishing records problem reminds us that history is not a fixed, complete story. It's a patchwork of surviving scraps, stitched together as best we can. And in that patchwork, there are huge holes where entire civilizations could have existed, thrived, and fallen, without leaving enough behind for us to know they were ever here. If the past has been reset more than once, those missing records are not just a curiosity, they are the reason we can't see the full picture. They are the silence between the fragments we've managed to preserve. And in that silence, the truth about our real history might be hiding. Advanced technology in ancient times. One of the most puzzling things about history is that, every so often, we stumble across evidence suggesting that ancient people may have had knowledge or technology far beyond what we usually credit them for. These discoveries challenge the idea of a simple linear progression from primitive tools to modern machines. They raise the possibility that at least some ancient societies were far more advanced, perhaps inheriting skills from an earlier forgotten age before a reset wiped most of it away. The Antikythera mechanism is perhaps the most famous example, discovered in a shipwreck off the coast of Greece, and dated to over 2,000 years ago. It's a complex arrangement of gears and dials, capable of predicting astronomical positions and eclipses with remarkable accuracy. It is essentially an ancient analog computer, a level of precision we didn't think possible for that time. What makes it even stranger is that no other device like it appears in the historical record for centuries afterward. How does such a sophisticated piece of technology appear seemingly out of nowhere and then vanish again? One explanation could be that it wasn't entirely invented at the time, but was instead a surviving fragment of knowledge from an older, lost tradition. Then there are the massive stone constructions around the world that show an understanding of engineering we can't easily explain. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, is aligned with incredible precision to the cardinal points of the compass. Its base is level within a fraction of an inch. And the stones, some weighing up to 80 tons, were placed with such accuracy that even a thin piece of paper can't fit between them. Modern engineers can replicate this precision, but doing so without modern tools and machinery would be a huge challenge. How did ancient builders achieve it? Was it simply remarkable skill, or were they working with techniques that have since been forgotten? Similar mysteries appear in South America, where the stonework of places like Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo in Peru features massive blocks fitted together in irregular shapes with no mortar, yet so tightly that they've withstood centuries of earthquakes. Some of these stones are so large that moving them today would require heavy machinery, yet they were somehow transported and placed by cultures without what we think of as industrial technology. Ancient India offers its own puzzles. Texts written thousands of years ago describe advanced astronomical knowledge, including the idea that the Earth orbits the Sun and the length of the solar year with remarkable accuracy. While it's possible these were calculated through observation, the precision raises questions about whether such knowledge could have been preserved from an earlier, more advanced period. There are also examples that don't fit neatly into the known timeline of invention. The Baghdad battery, a set of clay jars with copper and iron components found in Iraq and dated to around 2,000 years ago, may have been capable of producing a small electric current. If this was intentional, it would suggest a knowledge of electricity long before it was discovered in modern times. Some archaeologists believe it might have been used for electroplating metals, a process we think of as relatively modern. Even the precision cutting of ancient stones sometimes hints at tools we don't think they should have had. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, blocks of andesite, a very hard stone, have been carved with straight edges, perfect right angles, and precise drill holes. Achieving this with the simple tools we believe they had would be extremely difficult. If they did it without advanced tools, the level of skill is extraordinary. If they had such tools, it raises the question of where that technology came from. Skeptics argue that all these feats can be explained with enough ingenuity, labor, and time, and in many cases they may be right. But taken together, they form a pattern, sudden bursts of technological or engineering ability that don't seem to fit smoothly into the historical timeline, followed by periods where those abilities are lost. If history has been reset more than once, these could be the remnants of knowledge carried over from earlier civilizations, fragments that survived long enough to be used, but not long enough to be preserved for the future. It's also important to note that technology isn't always physical. Advanced knowledge can take the form of mathematics, astronomy, navigation, or medicine, all of which can be passed down through teaching, but are easily lost if the chain of transmission breaks. Polynesian navigators, for example, could travel vast distances across open ocean using only the stars, wave patterns, and bird movements for guidance. If such a skill were lost in a disaster, it might take centuries for another culture to rediscover it. In a world without printing presses, the survival of advanced knowledge depended on a small number of people. If those people died in a war, famine, or natural disaster, or if they simply failed to pass their knowledge on, it could vanish entirely. The result would be that later generations might marvel at artifacts or ruins without understanding how they were made. When we think about resets in history, advanced ancient technology becomes especially interesting. If a highly developed civilization existed tens of thousands of years ago, and it was wiped out by a natural or human-made catastrophe, a few pieces of its knowledge might survive, embedded in myths, preserved in scattered artifacts, or passed down in incomplete form. Over time, these fragments could resurface in later civilizations, creating those moments in history when technology seems to leap forward unexpectedly, only to stall or vanish again. This would explain why certain ancient achievements feel out of place, as though they belong to a different timeline. It would also suggest that what we see as the first invention of something might actually be a reinvention, sparked by the discovery of an old idea whose origins have been forgotten. If resets have happened more than once, then advanced technology in ancient times is not an anomaly, it's a clue. It's evidence that we may be living in just one of many technological peaks humanity has reached, each one built on the faint echoes of the one before. And just as those earlier peaks vanished, ours could too, the puzzle of repeated inventions. One of the more curious patterns in human history is how certain discoveries and inventions seem to appear more than once, often in different places and at different times. We usually explain this as independent invention, the idea that people facing similar problems will eventually find similar solutions. And while that explanation makes sense, it also opens the door to another possibility. What if some of these inventions aren't completely new at all, but rediscoveries of things that were known in earlier ages, before resets erased them from memory? Take writing, for example. Historians generally agree that writing developed independently in several different regions. Sumer in Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, and Mesoamerica. These systems are all distinct in style and symbols, yet each one marks a sudden leap from oral tradition to recorded history. It's as if, in each place, the idea of writing just appeared, fully formed enough to be useful, but without a clear, gradual build-up. Could this mean that the concept of writing, or even examples of it, survived from an earlier time and inspired these independent inventions? Metallurgy is another case. The smelting of metals like copper, bronze, and iron emerged in different parts of the world at different times, sometimes separated by thousands of years. Each emergence is treated as a fresh discovery, but the process is complex, involving mining, smelting at high temperatures, and creating durable alloys. It's possible that these skills were learned, lost, and relearned multiple times in human history. Agriculture follows a similar pattern. We're told that farming began around 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent and spread outward from there. But archaeological evidence shows that domestication of plants and animals also occurred independently in East Asia, Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific. This might simply reflect human adaptability, or it could mean that farming was practiced long before our current starting point, and then reintroduced after resets. Navigation skills too seem to rise and fall. Polynesian voyagers navigated the vast Pacific Ocean, using methods so precise they could travel thousands of miles between small islands without compasses or modern charts. This knowledge was later lost in some regions and had to be reconstructed through fragments of oral tradition. Similar patterns appear in the Mediterranean, where advanced seafaring techniques vanished after certain collapses, only to re-emerge centuries later. Even something as simple as the wheel has a puzzling history. The oldest known wheels appear around 3500 BCE in Mesopotamia, yet wheeled vehicles didn't appear everywhere at the same time. In some regions, they emerged suddenly, with designs already quite sophisticated. Why would such an obvious and useful invention take so long to appear in certain areas, unless the knowledge had to travel or be rediscovered after being forgotten? Then there's the case of ancient medicine. Some civilizations, like those in India, Egypt, and China, developed remarkably advanced medical practices, including surgery, herbal treatments, and even dental procedures. In many cases, this knowledge later declined or disappeared, only to be relearned in different places and times. This cycle of gaining, losing, and regaining knowledge fits perfectly with the idea of multiple historical resets. If resets have occurred, the pattern makes sense. As civilization reaches a certain level of technology, then a catastrophe wipes it out. Survivors pass on fragments of knowledge, but without the full context, the skills are incomplete. Generations later, those fragments inspire new inventions, which are actually echoes of earlier achievements. The repeated invention of similar tools, systems, and techniques, might also explain why certain developments seem to leap ahead without a long period of trial and error. When the wheel appears in a society for the first time, it's already functional. When complex architecture reappears, it's already capable of building massive, durable structures. These don't always look like the tentative first steps of an entirely new idea. They look like the refined products of something that's been done before. It's also worth noting that humans are storytellers. Survivors of a collapse might not have the means to preserve exact technical instructions, but they could pass down myths and tales that encode bits of forgotten knowledge. A legend about a skyboat might, over centuries, inspire someone to experiment with navigation. A story about a healing stone might lead to the rediscovery of a mineral with medicinal properties. Over time, these rediscoveries would appear in the historical record as brand new innovations, even though they were sparked by very old memories. Mainstream history tends to separate these cases into neat boxes, labeling each as an independent development. But when you step back and see the bigger pattern, the same key ideas emerging over and over, it raises questions. Why do humans keep inventing the same things? Why do some ideas vanish for centuries only to return, as if they never existed before? And why do certain leaps in knowledge seem to happen so suddenly? If history has been reset more than once, the answer might be simple: we've been here before. We've built, lost, and rebuilt the same tools and technologies many times. The repeated inventions are not coincidences, they're part of a cycle. This possibility is both fascinating and unsettling. It means that much of what we consider the unique achievement of our own time may have existed in earlier ages. It also means that if another reset happens, many of our modern inventions could one day be rediscovered by people who have no idea we ever existed. In that sense, the puzzle of repeated inventions is more than just a curiosity. It's a clue that our timeline may not be the first, and probably won't be the last. Theories from ancient myths. When historians and scientists look for clues about the past, they turn to artifacts, ruins, and written records. But there's another source of information that's often overlooked or dismissed. These ancient stories passed down through generations are usually treated as symbolic or purely fictional. Yet, when you read them closely and compare them across cultures, something curious happens. You start to see patterns, recurring themes that suggest they might be preserving distant memories of real events from long before our written history. One of the most common themes is the idea of a great flood. We hear it in the story of Noah from the Bible, in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, in Hindu texts describing the flood of Manu, and in countless indigenous traditions from the Americas to the Pacific Islands. These stories vary in detail, but they all describe a world-destroying flood that wiped away civilizations and forced survivors to start over. For mainstream historians, this might be an echo of real flooding events at the end of the last ice age, when melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise dramatically. But if history has been reset more than once, these myths could be collective memories of one or more catastrophic events that erased entire worlds. Another recurring theme is the idea of gods or sky beings who came to Earth and taught humans important skills: agriculture, writing, architecture, astronomy. In Sumerian mythology, the Anunnaki is said to have given humanity knowledge. In ancient Egypt, the god Thoth is credited with inventing writing and science. In Mesoamerican culture, Quetzalcoatl is a feathered serpent deity who brought wisdom to humans. If we strip away the supernatural language, these stories could be interpreted as legends of advanced beings, perhaps humans from an earlier, more advanced civilization who passed on fragments of their knowledge to less developed survivors after a reset. Many myths also speak of golden ages, periods when the world was at peace, the climate was favorable, and people lived in abundance. These golden ages always end suddenly, usually through disaster or divine punishment, leading to a decline into harder times. In the Greek tradition, Hesiod describes 5 ages of men, each one worse than the last. In Hindu cosmology, time is divided into yugas, with the current age being the least virtuous. This cyclical view of history, rise, fall, reset, repeat, aligns closely with the idea that civilizations have risen and fallen multiple times. There are also myths about lost lands and vanished cities. Atlantis is the most famous, described by Plato as a powerful civilization that sank into the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. While many treat Atlantis as pure fiction, similar stories appear around the world. The island of Lemuria, the sunken land of Murth, the city of Oz in French legend, and the submerged kingdoms in Celtic lore all tell of advanced societies destroyed suddenly by natural forces. Could these be distorted memories of real places lost to rising seas or geological upheavals? Some myths even describe what sound like advanced technologies. Ancient Indian texts, like the Mahabharata, speak of flying machines called vimanas and weapons that produce destruction, resembling modern descriptions of nuclear explosions. Norse mythology tells of magical hammers and swords that never miss their target. While these are framed as supernatural, it's possible that such imagery could have been inspired by real, long-lost technologies, exaggerated over centuries of retelling. The challenge with using myths as evidence is that they are layered with symbolism, moral lessons, and cultural embellishments. Over generations, details get added, changed, or merged with other stories. But even so, certain elements remain consistent, and when those elements match geological, archaeological, or astronomical evidence, it becomes harder to dismiss them entirely. For example, myths about a great flood might align with evidence of massive glacial melting and coastal flooding around 12,000 years ago. Stories about fiery destruction from the sky could correspond to meteor impacts. Myths about darkness covering the land could be memories of volcanic eruptions, and legends of lost islands might match known areas of submerged continental shelf that were once dry land. If history has been reset more than once, myths could be the only surviving records from those earlier ages. Instead of being preserved in stone or on paper, they survived in the human mind, carried across generations, reshaped by culture, but still holding echoes of real events. The people telling the stories might not have understood the events themselves, they simply repeated what they had been told. Over time, these memories became the myths we know today. What makes this even more intriguing is that myths from cultures separated by vast distances, with no known contact, often contain strikingly similar themes. How did flood myths, sky gods, and lost civilizations end up in both the Americas and the ancient Near East? How did the idea of a cyclical history appear in both Greek and Hindu traditions? If these cultures weren't directly connected, the simplest explanation might be that they were drawing on memories from a shared, much older past. Of course, skeptics argue that these themes are common because they're based on universal human experiences. Everyone has seen floods, storms, and the stars, so similar stories are bound to emerge independently. That's certainly possible. But the reset hypothesis offers another explanation that humanity shares not just similar imaginations, but fragments of a shared forgotten history. In this way, myths are like half-buried ruins. They are damaged, incomplete, and often surrounded by debris, but if you dig carefully, you might find the foundation of something real. And just like archaeology, interpreting them requires patience, comparison, and the willingness to look beyond the surface. If we take them seriously, ancient myths could be more than just entertainment or moral lessons. They could be the oldest surviving clues that our history is not a single, unbroken story, but a cycle of worlds rising, falling, and being reborn. Cataclysms. In oral histories, not all history is written down. For most of human existence, knowledge and events were passed from one generation to the next through spoken stories, oral histories. These traditions, still practiced by many cultures today, can carry memories for hundreds or even thousands of years. They often take the form of myths, legends, or sacred narratives, but hidden within the storytelling are details that may describe real events. When it comes to the idea of historical resets, oral histories can be particularly revealing because they sometimes speak of cataclysms, sudden, world-changing disasters that destroyed entire ways of life. In Aboriginal Australia, oral traditions speak of times when the coastline was much farther out than it is today, and of lands that were drowned by the sea. Modern science confirms that sea levels rose significantly at the end of the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago, flooding coastal plains worldwide. If these stories truly date back to that period, they could be among the oldest continuous human records of a real environmental change. They suggest that even without writing, humans can remember major events across vast spans of time. In the Pacific Islands, many oral traditions tell of great waves that swallowed villages and reshaped coastlines. Some of these stories match geological evidence of tsunamis caused by underwater earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. In Hawaii, for example, there are legends of massive waves arriving without warning, which align with the geological record of a prehistoric landslide off the coast that would have generated a tsunami hundreds of feet high. Among the Native American tribes of the Pacific Northwest, stories speak of a great shaking of the earth, followed by a wall of water that devastated coastal settlements. These accounts closely match what scientists now believe happened during the Cascadia earthquake of around 1700 CE, a massive quake and tsunami that also struck Japan, where it was recorded in historical documents. For centuries before modern geology, indigenous oral traditions had already preserved an accurate description of the event. Many African oral histories speak of long droughts that forced migrations, destroyed kingdoms, and changed entire cultures. Some traditions from the Sahara region tell of a time when the desert was green, filled with rivers and lakes. This matches paleoclimate evidence, showing that thousands of years ago, the Sahara was indeed a fertile grassland before a rapid shift in climate turned it into the desert we know today. In South America, Andean cultures have stories of fire raining from the sky, mountains that spit smoke, and days of darkness. These could be descriptions of volcanic eruptions or even meteor impacts. Some oral accounts describe ash covering the land and rivers running black, details that align with the known effects of large eruptions like that of Huayna Patina in Peru in 1600 CE, which caused global climate disruptions. What's important about these oral histories is that they often contain a mixture of vivid, physical detail and symbolic meaning. Over generations, the symbolic elements can grow, making the stories seem purely mythical. But when scientists investigate the natural phenomena described, floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, meteors, they often find that there is geological or archaeological evidence supporting the events. From the perspective of the reset hypothesis, these oral histories could be critical. If resets have happened more than once, the survivors of such events might not have been able to preserve written records, but they could still pass down the memory of what happened through stories. These stories might begin as direct accounts, but over centuries they would evolve, gaining cultural and spiritual layers. The core memory, however, could survive, a warning embedded in myth. One striking example comes from the Telling-It people of Alaska, who have stories about a great glacier advancing and forcing people to flee. These stories describe specific landmarks and changes in the landscape that match what glaciologists have found about the region's ice movement centuries ago. This suggests that oral history can preserve accurate environmental information across many generations, and if that's true for smaller-scale events, it might also be true for much larger catastrophes. Some researchers have proposed that even myths about the end of the world, found in many cultures, could be rooted in real resets. A society might experience a disaster so devastating that to the survivors it felt like the world itself had ended. Over time, the story becomes symbolic, representing not just the loss of a city or a kingdom, but the loss of an entire way of life. The resilience of oral histories also means they can survive in places where physical evidence is gone. Coastal floods erase buildings and artifacts, but a story can travel inland with survivors. Earthquakes can level cities, but the memory can be told to children and grandchildren. In some cases, oral histories may be the only surviving record of events from a distant past, events that would otherwise be completely unknown to us. Skeptics point out that oral histories are subject to change and distortion over time, and that's true, that even distorted memories can preserve the outline of real events, especially when those events are traumatic and unforgettable. If a great reset occurred thousands of years ago, we might expect to find its echoes in the myths and oral traditions of many different cultures, all describing, in their own way, a time when the world they knew came to an end. When we line up these traditions side by side, we start to see the possibility of a shared experience, different peoples separated by oceans, all remembering floods, fire, darkness, and a need to begin again. Whether these events happened at the same time or across different ages, they suggest that humanity has faced world-altering disasters before. In that sense, oral histories are like messages in bottles, carried across the ocean of time. They may be wrapped in metaphor, their details blurred by centuries of retelling, but they can still deliver a warning: worlds can end, and when they do, the survivors must start over. If we ignore these messages, we risk thinking that resets are impossible, when in fact the stories may be telling us they've already happened. The reset cycle hypothesis. If you start to connect the patterns, the vanishing civilizations, the sudden bursts of technology, the repeated inventions, the global myths, and the geological evidence of past cataclysms, a bigger picture begins to emerge. It suggests that resets in human history might not be rare accidents, but recurring events. This is the reset cycle hypothesis. The idea that civilization follows a repeating pattern of rise, peak, collapse, and renewal, with each cycle erasing much of what came before. In this view, history is not a straight line moving ever upward, but a loop. Each loop begins with survivors rebuilding after a collapse, rediscovering old skills and developing new ones. Over generations, they reach a point of high achievement in technology, art, architecture, science, and trade. But sooner or later, a combination of threats, natural disasters, climate shifts, famine, disease, or war, undermines the foundations. The collapse may be fast, like a sudden catastrophe, or slow, like centuries of decline. Either way, the end result is the same: the loss of infrastructure, knowledge, and population. Then the survivors begin again, starting a new cycle. One of the reasons this hypothesis is compelling is that we can see smaller versions of it in recorded history: the fall of the Roman Empire, the collapse of the Maya, the decline of the Indus Valley civilization. Each followed a pattern of growth, stability, crisis, and reset. In each case, the fall led to the loss of skills and knowledge that took centuries to recover. These are local or regional examples, but they hint at the possibility of similar cycles happening on a global scale, especially in the deeper past. The reset cycle hypothesis also offers a way to explain why humanity seems to forget certain technologies and then invent them again. If each cycle ends with a collapse severe enough to wipe out the specialists and the records, survivors may have to rely on more basic skills to get by. Over time, advanced techniques are lost, and only fragments remain, perhaps preserved in myths or symbols. When conditions improve in the next cycle, people may rediscover these techniques, believing them to be new inventions. The length of each cycle could vary. Some might last only a few hundred years before collapse, while others could stretch for thousands. The stability of a cycle would depend on how resilient a civilization is to threats, and on whether multiple disasters strike at once. A single event might not be enough to cause a full reset, but a chain of events could overwhelm even the most advanced society. What's interesting is that some ancient cultures seem to have built the idea of cycles into their worldview. The Hindu concept of yugas describes vast ages that repeat endlessly. The Maya had their own cyclical calendar, in which worlds are destroyed and remade. The ancient Greeks spoke of ages of humanity, golden, silver, bronze, and iron, each ending in decline before renewal. These beliefs might not have been purely philosophical. They could have been inspired by the observation of past rises and falls. The reset cycle hypothesis also changes how we see our present moment. If we are in the middle or near the peak of a cycle, the risks of collapse are not theoretical. They are inevitable unless we understand and prepare for them. The same forces that may have ended past cycles still exist today: environmental instability, resource depletion, social fragmentation, and global conflict. In fact, our current interconnected world might make us even more vulnerable. A disruption in one part of the system can quickly cascade across the globe. There is also the possibility that some cycles end not through natural or accidental causes, but through intentional resets. This idea is more speculative, but some researchers and thinkers have suggested that powerful groups or entities, whether human or otherwise, could deliberately dismantle a civilization for control, survival, or other purposes. If this has happened in the past, it would add another layer to the mystery of lost ages. The biggest challenge in proving the reset cycle hypothesis is evidence. Each collapse wipes out most of the records and infrastructure, and nature quickly reclaims the rest. After thousands of years, the traces that remain are often too fragmentary to reconstruct the full picture. This means we are left with scattered anomalies, ancient sites that don't fit the timeline, myths that hint at earlier worlds, and artifacts that seem out of place. On their own, these are easy to dismiss. Together they suggest a repeating story that we've only begun to recognize. If the reset cycle hypothesis is true, it has two important implications. First, our current civilization is not unique. Others have stood where we stand now, looking out at their world and believing their progress would last forever. Second, we may be underestimating both the age and the complexity of human history. Instead of a single arc from primitive to advanced, we might be living in the latest of many high points, each one built on the remains of those before. This idea can be unsettling because it removes the comforting illusion of permanence, but it can also be empowering. If we understand the cycle, we might be able to break it, or at least survive it with more knowledge intact. We could build systems designed to preserve history and technology, even through a collapse, ensuring that the next cycle starts with more than just fragments. For now, the reset cycle hypothesis remains a theory, one that sits at the edges of mainstream history, but the clues are there, scattered in ruins, encoded in myths, and written in the earth itself. Whether or not we accept the idea, it forces us to think differently about our place in time. We are not simply at the end of a long road from the past to the future. We may be in the middle of a loop, one that has turned many times before and will turn again. How long would it take to forget everything? When we think about the collapse of a civilization, it's easy to imagine ruins and scattered survivors, but what's harder to imagine, and maybe more important, is how quickly knowledge disappears when the systems that protect and pass it on are gone. If history has been reset more than once, the speed at which humans can forget everything they've achieved might be the key to understanding why earlier worlds left so little behind. Most people assume that knowledge is permanent once it's discovered, but in reality, it's incredibly fragile. Knowledge lives in people, in tools, in books, in digital storage, and all of those can be lost. If our modern world suffered a collapse today, we'd lose the vast majority of our information almost instantly. Without electricity, digital records would vanish in decades or less. Without functioning cities, libraries would decay. Without trained experts to pass on complex skills, the chain of understanding would break. The truth is, most people don't know how the systems around them work. We use computers, but only a small fraction of us could build one from raw materials. We drive cars, but few could make an engine from scratch. Even basic things, like purifying water, making medicine, or generating electricity, are skills concentrated in specialized fields. If those specialists were gone, their knowledge would vanish with them. History gives us real examples. After the fall of the Roman Empire, much of Europe lost access to technologies that had been common for centuries. Concrete, central heating, advanced plumbing, these became rare or disappeared entirely. Even something as simple as the recipe for certain Roman cements was forgotten for over 1,000 years. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries that similar materials were rediscovered. We can also look at isolated communities that have lost technology after being cut off. In some cases, groups that once had access to metal tools reverted to stone tools when trade or manufacturing stopped. They didn't stop using metal because it was inferior. They stopped because they no longer had the means to produce it. The rate at which knowledge fades depends on how complex that knowledge is and how many people hold it. Everyday skills, like farming, fishing, or basic construction, are more likely to survive because they're widely practiced. But advanced scientific and engineering knowledge is more vulnerable. If only a few thousand people in the world know how to do something, and they're all lost in a collapse, that skill is gone. Even language plays a role in forgetting. If future generations can't read the languages of their ancestors, the records we leave behind will be useless. Imagine finding a library full of books in a language you can't decipher. The information is there, but it might as well not exist. We already face this challenge with ancient scripts, like Linear A, which remain undeciphered despite decades of study. The environment speeds up forgetting too. In warm, wet climates, paper and cloth rot quickly. In deserts, winds can bury cities in sand. In jungles, plants and roots can reclaim entire buildings in decades. If you left a modern city unattended, within 500 years, it might be almost completely unrecognizable. In 5,000 years, it could be nothing but scattered traces, if anything at all. Without written records, the only way to preserve complex knowledge is through oral tradition. But oral tradition changes over time. Details fade, events become exaggerated, and practical instructions are replaced by symbolic stories. A description of a real machine might turn into a legend about a magical object. A memory of a great flood could become a myth about the gods punishing humanity. The core truth might still be there, but hidden under centuries of retelling. This is why resets are so effective at erasing the past. Once the people who understand the old world are gone, the survivors rebuild based on what they remember, which is often only what they directly needed to survive. Everything else is forgotten. Within just a few generations, the advanced world that once existed becomes a story of the time before, then a legend, then nothing at all. If we apply this to a deep past reset, the picture becomes clear. Imagine an advanced civilization 20,000 years ago. A disaster strikes, perhaps a global climate shift or a massive impact event. Most of the population is lost. Cities are destroyed, records burn, and survivors are scattered into small communities. They know how to hunt, gather, and make simple tools. But the skills for building machines, crafting metals, or producing medicine are gone within decades. In 100 years, the survivors' descendants have no living memory of what the world used to be. In 1,000 years, the very idea of that old civilization is gone, except for fragments in myth. The unsettling part is how fast this could happen to us. If our global infrastructure collapsed today, within 50 years, most advanced technology would be unusable. Within 100 years, it would be almost impossible to recreate from scratch without access to the original manufacturing base. In 500 years, people might look at surviving skyscrapers the way we look at the pyramids, as mysterious structures whose builders are half forgotten. And yet, this process doesn't just erase, it transforms. Some fragments of knowledge survive in unexpected ways. Practical inventions might be adapted into simpler forms. Stories might carry distorted memories of real tools or events. A myth about a sun chariot might come from a vague memory of flight. A tale about a light that never dies could be inspired by ancient lamps or electricity. In this way, even in forgetting, some faint echoes remain. Understanding how quickly we can forget everything also forces us to see the historical record differently. The fact that we don't see advanced technology in the deep past doesn't mean it never existed. It might simply have disappeared before it could leave enough traces for us to find. The materials could have decayed, the records could have been destroyed, and the knowledge could have been lost before it could be passed on. If resets have happened before, forgetting isn't just a side effect, it's the main reason we don't know about them. The speed at which civilizations can lose their memory means that even great worlds can vanish almost completely, leaving the future to wonder if they ever existed at all. The fragility of modern civilization. It's tempting to think of our modern world as indestructible. We have skyscrapers that pierce the clouds, airplanes that cross oceans in hours, satellites that connect the globe, and machines that can build almost anything. We imagine that once a civilization reaches this level of complexity, it's too advanced to collapse the way past societies did. But when you look closely, our modern world is far more fragile than it appears. If resets have happened before, we might be more vulnerable to one than any civilization that came before us. The reason is simple. Our world depends on layers of interconnected systems, and those systems depend on each other to survive. Our food supply depends on transportation. Transportation depends on fuel. Fuel production depends on electricity. Electricity depends on a functioning industrial base. If one layer fails badly enough, it can trigger a chain reaction that takes down the rest. This is what makes modern civilization strong in good times, but dangerously brittle in a crisis. Consider how quickly things can unravel when just one link in the chain breaks. In major cities, grocery stores typically carry only a few days' worth of food. If supply trucks stop arriving, shelves empty in less than a week. If power goes out, refrigerated goods spoil. Without clean water from treatment plants, disease spreads quickly. These are not slow processes, they happen within days. With is not slow processes, they happen within days. Our reliance on digital technology makes us even more exposed. Banking, communication, trade, healthcare, nearly everything depends on computer systems that can be disrupted by cyber attacks, power failures, or natural disasters. If the internet went down globally for even a few weeks, the effects would be devastating. Many businesses couldn't operate, supply chains would freeze, and critical services could collapse. We also live in an era of just-in-time manufacturing, where parts and materials arrive at factories exactly when they're needed, with minimal storage. This keeps costs low, but means there's almost no buffer if something interrupts the flow. A major disaster, whether natural or human-made, could stop production in key industries and ripple through the entire global economy. In some ways, ancient civilizations were more resilient. They relied on local resources, grew much of their own food, and could often survive disruptions to trade or communication. Our interconnected world gives us incredible capabilities, but it also means we're all tied to the same web, and if the web tears, everyone feels it. There's also the problem of specialization. In the modern world, most people work in highly specific fields. That's efficient in a functioning society, but it means few individuals have the broad survival skills needed to rebuild from scratch. In earlier times, more people knew how to farm, hunt, build shelters, and make tools. Today, if our systems failed, the majority of people would have to relearn these basics, often under extreme stress. Natural disasters remain an ever-present threat. Massive volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, hurricanes, and floods can still devastate entire regions. Add to that new risks we've created ourselves: climate change, industrial accidents, nuclear weapons, and the list of potential triggers for collapse is longer than ever. Unlike in the past, many of these threats are now global in scope. A severe climate event, for example, wouldn't just affect one region, it could disrupt agriculture and supply chains worldwide. The fragility of modern civilization is also psychological. We're accustomed to instant access to food, information, and comfort. If those conveniences vanished, many people would struggle to adapt. Fear, panic, and social unrest could spread faster than the actual physical damage, making recovery even harder. In a worst-case scenario, a major breakdown could push us into a rapid reset. Imagine a global event that takes down electricity and communications. Within weeks, many cities would become unlivable. Populations would scatter, searching for food and safety. Governments might collapse, and the ability to manufacture or maintain advanced technology would disappear. Even if some technology survived, without the full industrial network to support it, it would slowly fail. Within a generation, most of our modern knowledge could be gone. The unsettling truth is that in some ways, we're more at risk of a deep reset than ancient civilizations were. They could fall back on simpler systems when needed. We can't, or at least not easily. Our infrastructure is built for complexity, not simplicity. If it breaks, it doesn't gracefully downgrade to a simpler mode. It just stops. This fragility doesn't mean collapse is inevitable, but it does mean we're living in a system that could, under the right pressures, fail catastrophically and quickly. And if resets have happened before, this could be exactly how they began, with a civilization so interconnected and specialized that a single shock cascaded into a complete breakdown. Thinking about the fragility of our modern world forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Our current stability might be the exception, not the rule. If the reset cycle hypothesis is correct, we might be living near the peak of our own cycle, unaware of how close we are to the edge. The lesson isn't to give in to fear, but to recognize the vulnerability. Civilizations fall not because they are weak in every way, but because they are strong in ways that make them rigid. And when something rigid breaks, it breaks completely. The digital blackout scenario, of all the possible triggers for a modern reset, one of the most plausible and fastest acting is a sudden global digital blackout. We live in an age where nearly every part of civilization is tied to digital systems: banking, transportation, healthcare, communication, energy grids, supply chains, all depend on computers and the networks that connect them. Remove those, and the modern world doesn't just slow down, it stops. A digital blackout could happen in several ways. A massive solar storm, like the Carrington event of 1859, could send a burst of charged particles from the sun that fries satellites, disrupts GPS, and overloads power grids. Back then, it only caused telegraph systems to fail. Today, it would knock out the technology that runs almost everything. Another possibility is a large-scale cyber attack, a coordinated effort to disable or corrupt critical systems in multiple countries at once. There's also the chance of cascading failures. One key system goes down, triggering a chain reaction that spreads far beyond the initial problem. However it happens, the effect would be immediate and disorienting. Phones go silent, ATMs and credit card systems stop working, air traffic control loses communication with planes, stock markets freeze, hospitals can't access digital medical records or order supplies. Within hours, the disruption would be felt in every home and business. In the first few days, many people might assume it's temporary. They'd wait for the power and the internet to come back, using whatever food and cash they have on hand. But as hours turn into days, the situation would begin to change. Supermarkets, unable to restock, would run out of food quickly. Without refrigeration, perishable items would spoil, gas stations would run dry. As pumps stopped working, people in cities would start looking for ways to leave, creating traffic jams and unrest. Money would become a major problem almost instantly. With banks offline, there would be no way to access savings or transfer funds. In a world where most transactions are digital, the loss of electronic payment would bring commerce to a standstill. Some places might switch to barter or use whatever physical currency is available, but these systems would be patchwork and unreliable. The blackout would also cripple communication. Without the internet or cell networks, news would spread slowly and unevenly. Rumors would replace verified information. People wouldn't know whether the outage was local or global, whether it was caused by a natural disaster, an attack, or something else entirely. This uncertainty would feed fear and make coordinated responses almost impossible. Critical infrastructure would struggle to function. Water treatment plants and pumping stations rely on electricity and digital controls. If they stopped, clean water would become scarce within days. Hospitals would be overwhelmed, operating on limited generator power until fuel ran out. Emergency services would face shortages of equipment, fuel, and personnel. In rural areas, the impact might be less immediate. People there might have more physical resources and local skills to fall back on, but the loss of supply chains would eventually reach them too. Medicines, spare parts, and many modern essentials come from far away. Without transport and communication, those links would break. If the blackout lasted weeks or months, the damage would become irreversible. Factories and distribution centers would shut down permanently. Agricultural systems, which depend on machinery, fertilizers, and global trade, would falter. Governments would lose the ability to coordinate relief efforts, and some might collapse entirely. Law enforcement could be stretched too thin to maintain order, leading to spikes in crime and violence. Within a year of a sustained digital blackout, the world could be unrecognizable. Cities might be largely abandoned. Populations would migrate in search of food and safe water. Communities would become more isolated, relying on whatever local production they could manage. Most modern technology would be useless without the complex systems that keep it running. From a reset perspective, this scenario is particularly dangerous because it doesn't require a total physical destruction of the world, only the breakdown of the systems that hold our civilization together. The knowledge of how to rebuild those systems might still exist on paper or in surviving experts' memories, but without functioning industry, communication, and supply chains, that knowledge would be extremely hard to put into action. Generational forgetting would start quickly. The first generation after the blackout would remember the modern world, but their children would grow up in a much simpler, harsher reality. Without preserved infrastructure, advanced technology would become a relic, something people spoke about in disbelief, like a fairy tale. Within a few generations, the time of the glowing screens might be remembered only in stories, stripped of detail, and treated as legend. This is exactly how earlier resets could have played out. The cause might have been different: a volcanic winter, a comet impact, a global war, but the effect would be the same. The systems holding a civilization together collapse, and the survivors can't bring them back fast enough. Over time, the memory fades, leaving only hints for future archaeologists to puzzle over. The digital blackout scenario is also a reminder of how quickly we could lose our place in history. We like to think of our era as permanent, but in truth it's only a few missed steps away from vanishing. The very complexity that makes our civilization powerful also makes it delicate. And if history has been reset before, this may have been one of the easiest and fastest ways for it to happen. How history gets rewritten. After each reset, when a civilization collapses, the immediate focus for survivors is staying alive, finding food, shelter, and safety. The records of the old world, if they survive at all, are usually scattered, damaged, or inaccessible. Over time, as new societies form, a strange thing happens. The past isn't just forgotten, it's rewritten. The way people remember history after a reset is rarely the same as the way it actually happened. This rewriting isn't always deliberate. In the early stages, after a collapse, stories of the time before are told by the few who remember it. These accounts might be accurate at first, but each time they're retold, details fade or shift. Over generations, the stories become simplified, exaggerated, or merged with local myths. Events that were once historical start to sound like legend. Technologies become magic. Cities become great palaces of the gods. What began as memory becomes myth. We can see this process even in recorded history. When the Western Roman Empire fell, people in medieval Europe remembered Rome as a distant golden age, but their understanding of it was incomplete. They knew the Romans had built great roads and cities, but much of the political, scientific, and engineering knowledge that made those possible was gone. As centuries passed, the image of Rome was shaped as much by imagination as by reality. In some cases, rewriting is intentional. New rulers or cultures may reshape the story of the past to justify their own power. They might portray the old civilization as corrupt or doomed, framing their own rise as a kind of salvation. They may destroy or alter surviving records to eliminate evidence that contradicts their narrative. This is not unique to ancient times. Even in our modern era, governments and leaders have been known to manipulate history to suit their needs. Religious transformation often plays a role in rewriting after a reset. When a new belief system emerges or becomes dominant, it may reinterpret past events in spiritual terms. Disasters might be remembered as divine punishment. Technological wonders might be attributed to gods or supernatural beings. Over time, these interpretations become the official version of events, replacing any practical explanation that once existed. Language shifts also contribute to rewriting. If a society's language changes over time, old records become harder to understand. Without careful preservation and translation, the meaning of ancient texts can be lost or altered. A simple mistranslation can change the entire interpretation of an event, and once that version takes hold, it can be nearly impossible to correct. Sometimes, rewriting happens because survivors simply can't understand the technology or systems of the old world. Imagine a future where people come across the ruins of an airport. Without knowledge of flight, they might assume the structures were temples. The rusted remains of airplanes could be interpreted as giant birds or mythical creatures. In the absence of context, people fill in the gaps with the most familiar ideas they have, and those ideas become history. This process could explain why so many ancient ruins are surrounded by myths about gods, giants, or supernatural builders. If earlier civilizations reached high levels of technology and then fell, their remnants would have been puzzling to the people who came after. With no way to recreate the technology, they would explain it in the only terms they knew: religion, legend, and magic. Over long stretches of time, rewritten history becomes the only history. The real events fade beyond recovery, the myths solidify into cultural truth, taught to each generation as fact. Without surviving records or physical evidence, there's no way to challenge the story, and so it becomes the foundation of the new world's understanding of itself. The reset hypothesis suggests that this process may have happened multiple times. Each cycle would leave the next with only fragments of the truth. If we are in such a cycle now, it's possible that some of our own ancient history is itself a rewritten version of something much older. What we think of as the dawn of civilization might, in fact, be the beginning of just the most recent chapter. The idea is unsettling because it means even our best historical reconstructions could be built on layers of altered memory. Archaeology can uncover artifacts, but it can't always tell us the story behind them with certainty. Written records help, but only if they survive.